have the microphone here.
Let me start by some sort of a biographical note to get us into the topic. I usually don't use PowerPoint presentations. I find it a tool that limits one's imagination, and I'd rather talk directly to the audience. But if I had a PowerPoint presentation, the first picture, the first slide, which, if you can imagine, would be myself at the age of 12, holding and waving the Israeli flag. By which I would have meant to tell you that I had a very ordinary Israeli upbringing, a very typical Israeli Jewish biography. Born to a Jewish family, going through the usual stages in the life of a young Israeli who was born in the 1950s, which meant serving in the Israeli army. I had the unfortunate luck to be also in a war, the 1973 war on the Golan Heights. And the first slide would say, in a way, what went wrong? How did this person who was educated within the Israeli system became a challenger of the dominant historical narrative of that state? The second slide would probably show me with a confused face. And that's why I decided not to have a PowerPoint presentation. I had no idea how to do that. But you should have seen a person that looks bewildered or confused. In the early 1970s, a BA student at the Hebrew University who loved history. I was very bad in school in any other discipline, that is high school, but I was very good in history for some reason. So I chose history also as a BA student. I took Middle Eastern history and international relations in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And the bewilderment had to do with the fact that towards the third year of my undergraduate studies, I became more and more focused on the history of Israel and Palestine, and not just on the region itself. And in the third year, I became aware of a kind of a contradiction in the way that history was taught. There was, on the one hand, a sense that Palestine throughout the centuries was an empty place. And we hardly talked about anyone else in the modern history of Palestine, apart from the Jewish community there. And yet, when we arrived to the end of the BA and we talked about the events of 1948, we were told that the Palestinians left voluntarily in 1948, and that's how the Palestinian refugee problem was created. And I remember asking one of my professors, if these people left, who were they if the country was empty? His answer was something to do about students who are troublemakers and should know better and maybe should choose a different career. The third clip or slide would show me in a much happier face, a much more assured face. And this is when I started my PhD studies in Oxford in England in 1980. It became very clear to me when I finished my undergraduate studies as a historian that I would like very much to study the history of my own country. That makes sense. Secondly, that I would like to look at both sides of the argument, if I can. And one of my professors suggested that I should look at the British policy because both sides hated the British. And maybe that would give me a kind of a more objective perspective on the history of the country. So I knew I had to go to Britain and to look at British policy towards Palestine. Then, as those of you who are historians know, you cannot study for a PhD the whole history of a country. You have to choose a person or a pivotal moment or a formative event. And it was only natural that I chose 1948, a year that in the Zionist narrative is a miraculous year, where when 2,000 years of Jewish exile come to an end, a very happy year. And for the Palestinians, the most catastrophic year, disastrous year in their history. And this kind of contradiction between the two framing of the year meant that 48 was a very good topic for historical research. And I decided to study the British policy towards the 1948 events. That was the topic of my PhD students. And when I was accepted to the University of Oxford, I had a choice of supervisors, and I said to myself, I need to do it differently than most Israeli PhD students, and I have to choose an Arab supervisor. I actually wanted a Palestinian supervisor, but there wasn't anyone in Britain at the time. So the closest I could do was to work with a famous Orientalist, Albert Khurani, who was a Lebanese and not a Palestinian, but who testified on behalf of the Palestinians in the Anglo-American Committee of 1948. Albert Khurani, when he first met me, warned me. He said, you have a chance, you have an exit point here. Are you sure you want to work on 1948? And I said, yes. Why? He said, well, it will change your life. And I had no idea what he was talking about. Many years later, I understood what he meant, but that was too late. I couldn't get out of it. At the time that I decided to work on 1948, there was another group of Israeli historians who also, probably for similar reasons, thought that 1948 was a good topic for a PhD. One of the reasons all of us decided to look at 1948, apart from the reasons I've mentioned, was very practical. Under the secrecy laws of Great Britain, and to a certain extent of Israel and the United Nations, documents are declassified after 30 years. So the documents pertaining to 1948 were released in 1978. And I came to Oxford in 1980. So it made sense to go and look at the documents at which very few historians had researched before us. But something very interesting happened. There was quite a large group of Israeli historians who went to the British archives, to the Israeli archives, the American archives, the United Nations archives in the early 1980s. But only a very small number of them came out with a new insight about their own country's history. The vast majority of them said to themselves and to others, we haven't found anything in the documents which was new to us. And that was very surprising to me, because for me and for three or other four historians, which, as was mentioned, we were called later the new historians, what we saw in the documents totally changed our historical perspective on the past in general and on 1948 in particular. So why did the others not see what we saw? This question led me to venture into the area of historiography, of the philosophy of history, the question of subjectivity and objectivity in history. And it became clear to me that what influences the story you tell eventually as a professional historian is not just what you find in the documents. They're not just the facts. They have a lot to do with your moral position, your ideological orientation, the time in which you write, and your personality. They are all factors that influence the story you finally tell. In particular, I found out that this was important for how you treat a document in the archive. Do you treat the document as a reflection of the truth? Or is the document yet another interpretation of the truth? Do you trust the interpretation of an Israeli soldier in 1948? And do you trust an interpretation of Israeli soldier in 2018? If you have some doubts about their reports in 2018, you should have the same doubts about the reports in 1948. This is not a direct route to the truth. It's just another obstacle on the way to the truth. And apparently what happened was that a small group of Israeli historians did not only read in the document something that they didn't know about, for reasons that had to do with the contemporary reality in which they lived, suspected that what they read in the Israeli documents was not the truth, and deconstructed the documents in order to find out what they thought was the true story about Palestine. I will give you one example to show you how it works. If you go to the documents, you can see that the Israeli army orders the troops in 1948 to occupy the enemy bases, to destroy them, and to expel the enemy outside of the country. Now, if you are a bit open-minded and you think in the 1980s about the occupation of the West Bank, if you think about the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, then you say, wait a minute, what is this base? Is it a military bunker with outposts, with regular soldiers, armed soldiers, or is it a village? It turns out it's a village, and that the enemy troops are babies, women, old men, and some soldiers. But they are all together the enemy. And therefore, destroying the enemy base in the document, if you report verbatim the document, you could think that this was a conventional war in 1948. But if you are familiar with the reality in your own time, you understand that the base is a village or a neighborhood in a city. And therefore, the destruction of the base is the demolition of a village. And the killing of the enemy could be a massacre of civilians. That's why Israelis treated the Dahaya neighborhood in Beirut as an enemy base, but it's a civilian neighborhood. They treat the city of Gaza as a military base, but it's a civic space. And they treated the city of Jenin in 2002 as a military base. So it was very clear to me that the historians all went to the archives in the same door, but we went out in different doors. And the exit doors we chose had a lot to do with our political orientation, our moral understanding, and our willingness to challenge the hegemonic narrative which educated us until the point we met new evidence. Because in Israel, the narrative that you coexist with is a very powerful narrative. And it really accompanies you from the kindergarten through your life. History is very important to the Zionist movement, which was, like so many other movements in the world, a settler colonialist movement. And for settler colonialists, that is, people who come from abroad to another country, it's very important to have a clear historical story that explains to themselves and to others what are they doing in someone else's homeland. And that's why we, as Israeli Jews, we get a very clear notion of the narrative. And we live with it very closely. And I think one of the obstacles for people in archives who can see or have the option of seeing evidence that contradicts this narrative, one of the obstacles is that leaving the narrative, challenging the narrative, could be deemed as an act of treason. In fact, I was called by my rivals in Israel as a traitor for not adopting the Zionist narrative about the events of 1948 and about the history of Palestine in general. So The challenge is so big, in fact, that to be honest with you, I think you are in the presence of the new historians movement in this room. You didn't understand my English humor. I'm the only new historian left. That's what I meant. It was a movement, and I'm the only new historian. So if you want to get rid of the new history of Israel, you just have to get rid of me. And the reason is that some of my colleagues could not withstand the accusation of treason, did not expect, I think, the kind of response they would get for what they thought was the truth, but what their peers thought was an act of defiance, subversiveness, and treason. So I think that that's very important to understand, not only in the context of Israel and Palestine. Any historian who would challenge their national narratives, their hegemonic narratives, should not expect any gratitude from the society, especially not at times of conflict, where historical narratives are as important as ammunition as is the military capacity of both sides. So those who were part of the new history challenged the Israeli narrative on several points. I will mention a few of them. On 1948, the challenge itself appeared as books, as articles, as interviews in the newspapers, in television, on radio. In fact, it was quite important for many Israelis, the debate on the 48 events, especially in the 1990s. In one of my books, I describe a debate between the new and old historians at the University of Tel Aviv, which coincided with the semi-final of the soccer world competition that actually was here in the United States. And Israelis love soccer. They love soccer. And for Israelis to miss a semi-final is quite unheard of. And therefore, the organizers for the debate chose a very small room, even smaller than this one. They didn't think many people would show a debate about the history of 48. And lo and behold, 700 people came. And in the last minute, we had to find the largest hall possible in the University of Tel Aviv. People found it very interesting in the 1990s. You won't find 7 people today who would come to debate about 48 in Israel. That's how Israel has changed within 20 years. It's amazing. But in the 1990s, probably also because of the Oslo Accord, which today we mentioned 25 years to the Oslo Accord, and the sense that maybe there is a chance for peace with the Palestinians, I think that also created this idea that maybe we should revisit some of the history and so on. I think that also contributed to the interest in the debate. So for a while, this was a very lively debate. I will talk in a minute how it died and how it disappeared. But I would say that between 1990 to 2000, for 10 years, the debate about the past was a very prominent part of the Israeli culture, not only in the academia, also among playwrights, in the theater, in films, among journalists and educators, among artists. It was quite an attractive topic for many people who were producing knowledge, whether it was an academic knowledge or cultural knowledge or any kind of knowledge. At the heart of it was our work about 48. The first, and I think not so important point we made, it was important for Israelis, but I think in hindsight, it was not the most important point. But the first point we did, we grew up on the myth that in 1948, Israel was a David that defeated an Arab Goliath. There is an atlas on the Arab-Israeli conflict, which was prepared by one of Britain's greatest historians who died just a year ago, Sir Martin Gilbert. It's called the Atlas of the History of the Arab-Israeli Conflict. And if you want to understand the Israeli narrative, you have to look at the map that this atlas has on the 1948 war. You can see thick, huge arrows coming from the Arab world into Palestine You need a very good eyesight to detect the Israeli arrow that comes to meet them. You understand what the image conveys, right? So we did something very simple. We counted troops, which we're not supposed to do apparently, because we found out that there were more Israeli soldiers than Arab soldiers in the 48 war. So it was not exactly David and Goliath. Maybe there were two Davids, semi-David, semi-Goliaths, I don't know, whatever you want. But it was not a David and Goliath. Not only that, we found out that the Israeli army was far better equipped in terms of arms, far better trained, that the Egyptian army, for instance, was made of half of the Egyptian contingent that was sent into Palestine were prisoners, Muslim Brotherhood prisoners, whom the Egyptian government gladly sent to the campaign, hoping that they gave them a one-way ticket to Palestine. The most efficient Arab army, the Arab Legion of Transjordan, it was called then, Jordan of today, which had military officers running it, British military officers running it. That army was very limited in its operation in 1948 because Jordan and Israel had an agreement that in return for annexing the West Bank to Jordan, the Jordanian army would have a limited role in the 48 war. And the Lebanese and Syrian army were not really a very powerful or impressive as military rule. But I don't want to underestimate the fact that there was a war between Israel and contingents from the neighboring Arab states who entered Palestine on the 15th of May 1948, the day that the British mandate or rule over Palestine ended. And this was a war. This was a proper war. People were killed on both sides. Well, one should say that. I think the most important point we made, or the most important myth we debunked, which is far more important than David and Goliath, although, as you can understand, it also is important. But the most important myth we debunked, which really got us into trouble, and I think was the main reason why few of us could not withstand the pressure, was about how the Palestinians became refugees in 1948. That was the most important issue. There were two kind of versions to the Israeli narrative about 48. There was kind of the official narrative that you could have found, which was a bit ridiculous. I think maybe some Israelis even felt it was ridiculous, which said that the Palestinians left voluntarily because the Arab leaders, the leaders of the neighboring Arab states and the leaders of the Palestinians told them to leave and to make way for the invading Arab armies with a promise to come back. This is what was the official narrative. Then there was a more sophisticated narrative that said, well, some people might have been expelled, but it all started in May, on the 15th of May, 1948, when the Arab armies invaded Palestine. And when the Arab armies invaded Palestine, there was a war, and people in a war become refugees. It happens all over the world. So it was the war that was responsible for the making of the Palestinian refugee problem. Now, to our great surprise, for those of us who had been open-minded enough, we saw that both narratives did not fit what we found in the archives. What we found in the archives is that from the mid-1930s, and definitely immediately after the Second World War, the Zionist political and military leadership contemplated and planned mass expulsion of Palestinians in order to create what they thought would be a Jewish democratic state. They wanted as much of Palestine as possible, with as few Palestinians in it as possible. Their main problem in 1947, 1948, when the British rule came to an end, was that the Jews in Palestine were only 1/3 of the population. And even when the United Nations took over the issue of Palestine from Britain and suggested to partition Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state in November 1947, the demographic was such that even in the Jewish state, that was offered by the United Nations, the Jews were still not the majority because there were too few Jews in Palestine in 47, 48. And the solution, definitely after the Second World War, in the eyes of the leading Zionist politicians and military commanders, was very clear. What I called in my book of 2007, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. The decision to expel massively the Palestinians from any area that would become the Jewish state eventually was taken in March, in the beginning of March 1948. That is 2 months before the Arab armies entered Palestine. And we wrote a story that most Israelis found very disturbing. We said, actually, the Arab armies entered Palestine because the Zionist movement was already expelling Palestinians for 2 months. And these Palestinian refugees began to reach the Arab capitals. And there was a pressure by Arab public opinion on the Arab governments to do something, especially after the Deir Yassin massacre on the 9th of April 1948, which was broadcast all over the Arab world. It was not the only massacre. When you expel people, there are always massacres. People don't like to be expelled. And when they refuse, you shoot them. But the most known massacre in those days was the massacre of a small village near Jerusalem, Deir Yassin. And that in particular put pressure on the Arab governments, who, by the way, didn't want to send one soldier into Palestine. The Egyptian parliament decided on the 13th of May, 2 days before the 15th of May, to send an army into the Sinai Peninsula and from there into Palestine. And as I said, they decided to send mostly the prisoners from the Muqattam camp where the Muslim Brotherhood were interned. So we described a sequence of events by which we said, actually, the Palestinians did not become refugees because of the war. They became refugees because the Zionist movement planned their massive expulsion, what I called the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Ethnic cleansing is a crime against humanity. Ethnic cleansing is not justified by anyone in any circumstances. You cannot massively expel people just because of who they are. And it was very systematically planned. In March 48, the army adopted something called Plan D or Plan Dalet. And according to that plan, Palestine was divided into areas, and each brigade of the Jewish Zionist army, later became the Israeli army, had a list of villages to occupy and to destroy and to expel. The major problem for the Zionist movement was the urban space in Palestine. There were tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living in 11 towns. The most important of them were Jaffa and Haifa. And it's important to remember that Jaffa and Haifa were de-Arabized in April 1948, not after the Arab armies entered Palestine, but before the Arab armies entered Palestine. These are not small details. They are very important. The sequence is very important here, because the Arab world was blamed that in 1948 he wanted to destroy the Jewish state. Nobody tells the story the way we told it. I mean, there were Palestinian historians who were trying to tell the story in such a way, but nobody listened to them. We kosherized, if you want, the Palestinian narrative. You needed a Jew to do the job, which irritated a lot of my Palestinian friends, and I understand it. But I told them there was no other way of doing it. They would not listen to you in America if you are a Palestinian historian, but they would listen to you if you are an Israeli Jewish historian, which they did, which is true. So my hometown, Haifa, had 75,000 Palestinians living in it. Within 2 days, 2,000 were left. 3,000 Palestinians were left out of 45,000 in the city of Jaffa. They were expelled within 10 hours. What is incredible, we found out that actually we didn't even need the archives for that. We needed the archives for understanding the planning of the ethnic cleansing. But we did not need the archives to know what happened. We actually found out that the New York Times had a correspondent, I think you call it today, was embedded with the Jewish forces, had some other newspapers, and they wrote home reports, very accurate reports, of what was going on. But the editor of the New York Times decided to put it on page 5 or page 6, and I think it just escaped the attention of people. The Red Cross was really disturbed by what was going on, and the emissaries of the Red Cross wrote very powerful description of what happened. But the Red Cross headquarters in Geneva said, 3 years after the Holocaust, we don't want to blame the Jews of mass murder, expulsion, rape, and poisoning. There was only one instance in which the Red Cross decided to brave this self-censorship that it imposed on itself. Israeli troops poisoned the water of Acre, in order to make the city surrender. And the Red Cross reported this to the United Nations. One of the reasons that it got known was that there were still some British doctors working in the hospital in Acre who themselves got the typhus out of this poisoning act. Israel apologized and so on, but and this, by the way, again, happened before the 15th of May. It's very interesting. In the 1990s, an Israeli reporter interviewed the 2 Israeli soldiers, who injected the typhus into the water. I don't know if anybody of you have been in Acre. Acre's water supply comes from an aqueduct, a Roman aqueduct, which is still there. It was the main supply. So the water goes into the old city in the open, so you can easily poison it. And 2 soldiers apparently felt very bad about it many, many years later, after I wrote it in my book, gave an interview to Yediot Achronot, which is an Israeli daily, and admitted that they were the ones who put the poison. And I think that was, for me, a moment of epiphany, only in the sense that it didn't shock anyone in Israel. I mean, nobody denied it, nobody said anything about it. Okay, so you poisoned some people, so what? That also explained to me this sense of commitment that I felt when I wrote my books on 48, and why my colleagues didn't have a similar sense of commitment. Maybe they didn't think there was something terribly wrong with poisoning the water of a city. For me, I don't know how you feel about it, but for me, it's a horrific crime. It's a horrible thing to do, even in war. In war, you don't poison people's houses. You don't poison. This is a crime, a war crime. People who do this usually sit all their life in jail. So our understanding was that Palestinians became refugees because the Israelis wanted to create a Jewish democratic state. In other words, they wanted to come to the first elections in Israel with the assurance that there is a Jewish majority so that the democracy would be Jewish. And I think that explains the massive expulsion of the Palestinians. Within 9 months, 500 villages, half of Palestine villages, were destroyed, wiped out. And on the ruins of these villages, Israel planted forests. They imported 10,000 pine trees from Europe to cover up some of the ruins. They also thought that the landscape was too Arab, so they wanted a European landscape. The pine trees in most places, by the way, are very ill. They don't fit the climate. In other places, they built Jewish settlement on the ruins of the Palestinian villages, quite often using the same name, the Arabic name, and giving it a Hebrew name to show that this is not an occupation of a village, it's a redemption of the village. Namely, we're going back to a village that was ours 2,000 years ago, but happened to be Arab for 2,000 years. So Safuria becomes Tzipori. Yajur becomes Yagur, right? Lubia becomes Lavi. Almost every kibbutz and settlement you can see in pre-67 Israel is built on the ruins of a Palestinian village. The third myth we debunked, again, I think was less important than the second one, was that the myth was that after the war, Israel stretched its hand for peace and there was no one to reciprocate it. We actually found out that there was quite a willingness in the Arab world and among the Palestinians to renegotiate the reconciliation and peace, and it was actually the Israeli government that was intransigent and felt, quite normally one should say, that given the achievements they have gained in 48, there was no reason for negotiation, because any negotiation would involve compromising or giving up territory or giving up or of being forced to allow the people to return to their homes. So Israel had no incentive whatsoever to go into a proper peace negotiations. But I think that was less important. I think what really was important was that we talked about the way the Palestinians became refugees. Interesting things happened afterwards in Israel. Other historians and sociologists or people who dealt with knowledge felt that if we were able to ask these brave questions about 48, maybe there are other chapters that have to be re-examined. So, for example, academics who were from an Arab Jewish origin, namely their parents or they themselves came from Arab countries or Muslim countries, revisited the way the young state has treated what is called the Mizrahi Jews, the Jews of Iraq, the Jews of Morocco, the Jews of Syria. And they discovered the discrimination, and mainly I think what they discovered in the archives was that the greatest fear among the Jewish leaders of the young state of Israel was that they are injecting Arabs into the Jewish state again, be it Jewish Arabs, it didn't matter. So they found the whole project of de-Arabization. De-Arabization meant that you have to convince these people to change their Arabic names to Hebrew names, to try and get rid of the Arabic accent, and to also accept that they have to prove themselves that they're not Arabs. And the only way you can prove yourself that you're not Arab is become racist towards Arabs. So this de-Arabization was a very powerful project, accompanied by academics who believed in the theory of modernization and thought that this would be for the benefit of these Jews who came from Arab countries. So that was also part of the new history. No less important was the new history that dealt with the manipulation of the Holocaust memory in Israel. Very sensitive issue. The fact that Israel treated very badly the survivors of the Holocaust. It preferred much more the victims, the dead victims of the Holocaust, in order to gain political capital on this issue. And there was an attempt to say that there has to be much more universal memory coming out of the Holocaust rather than a Zionist one. So this was, and I don't have time to include all the chapters of the new history. I just want to say there was not just about 1948. The last chapter became even more incisive, I think, and in many ways, maybe it was kind of shooting us ourselves in the foot because it really killed the new history. And that's when several of us decided also to re-examine the narrative that said that Zionism is nationalism. And we decided to examine the possibility that Zionism was colonialism, and even a settler colonialist movement. And we used the paradigm of colonialism and settler colonialism. So we were not just talking about a policy in 1948 or in the 1950s. We were talking about the very idea of the state, the very ideology of the state. And we question its validity. And I think that was one step too much for the Israeli academia, political and cultural establishment. And together with the fact that we started this project with the outbreak of the second intifada, the second uprising in the occupied territories that also spilled over into Israel itself, the country, the society was in no mood anymore to hear criticism of the past, definitely not criticism of the very ideological nature of the state. And quite a few of the new historians retracted. Some even published very embarrassing mea culpa kind of I'm sorry kind of articles, which were quite pathetic. And others left. And therefore, I think you will find very little impact of the new history on the Israeli educational system, on the media, on the discourse. In fact, the whole Israeli political system moved to the right after 2000. And moving to the right meant also that you are not at all encouraged to look critically either at the present or at the past. In fact, in 2010, the Israeli Knesset passed a law which is called the Nakba law, which says that you are not allowed to frame the 1948 events as a Nakba, as a disaster. Unbelievable. They passed a law which should tell us how we should frame an event in the past. The reason is that it was very clear to the Israeli authority that they might be able to silence the Jewish voices who wrote critically about the past, but they cannot prevent the Palestinian citizens in Israel from looking at their own history and talking about the Nakba, or even as they say in Arabic, al-Nakba al-Mustamira, the ongoing ethnic cleansing. And I will end and open it up for you by saying something which I think is very important to understand. The late Edward Said said, and I think there was a very poignant idea that he had. He said, if in 1948 the ethnic cleansing of Palestine would have stopped, if it would be one event, one-off event, as terrible as it was, it would have been possible to build a new kind of reality in the relationship between Jews and Arabs. But he said it didn't stop in 1948. Between 1948 and 1967, Israel expelled 36 villages in order to downsize the number of Palestinians within the Jewish state. When Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, it expelled 300,000 Palestinians. 3 refugee camps near Jericho were emptied. The Muslim quarter in Jerusalem near the Wailing Wall was emptied. Since 1967 until today, another 250,000 Palestinians were expelled in various means from the West Bank. And the expulsion, the ethnic cleansing continues as we speak. Sometimes it's just 1 Palestinian a day, sometimes it's more. But the main issue is that the Israeli notion of democracy is totally connected to demography. Namely, we cannot have a proper democracy unless you have a clear Jewish majority. And all the means are justified to get this majority. Massacre, ethnic cleansing, inducing people to leave, not allowing them to return. It's all part of the same methodology to sustain a democracy on the basis of racist demography. What is surprising is, of course, that the world tolerates it and calls Israel the only democracy in the Middle East. And the big question is, do we have the power, the will, and the commitment to change it from within, to change it from without, by boycotting, divestment, and sanction of Israel? Can we help Israelis and Palestinians to get to a place where they could live as equal citizens in a democracy, which is a flawed political system, but it's the best political system we can have? Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so very much. I learned so much from this lecture and similar lectures, and I hope you learned something new that's coming from an Israeli historian. So, time for discussion. There's no democracy without demography. So, the 1948 did not stop there, as it was well framed by Edward Said, that it was just 1948. There was still a chance to have peaceful coexistence, but 1948 is still going on now. And this, by the way, was in 2019, this lecture. Right? So what we're witnessing now is a continuation of the same massacres and expulsion and changing demography. And now we're talking about the greater Israel, and which would require empty Gaza. And this is actually what we're hearing in the media now. They are putting severe pressure under the Egyptian government to allow people in Gaza to go to Sinai. And Egypt, for those of you, I'm originally from Egypt, is going through a very, very difficult economical situation and political as well. So are very vulnerable, don't have the power they have in the past to negotiate and to be like a broker in this peace process. Egypt lost, unfortunately, its influence. And God knows what will happen in the future. I personally won't be surprised if the Egyptian people opened Rafah and have all these 2 million people coming into Sinai. God knows what is going to happen, but it seems this is the plan. So, I want to hear from you, and let's have some sort of discussion. You have the other microphone here. So, and I want to give the microphone to Dr. Saleh to say something, please. Turn this off now.
Assalamu alaikum. This gentleman who spoke was born in 1950. I was born in 1948 at the same time. So we can relate absolutely to personal experience. Let me tell you how my family became refugees and how we are now citizens of Israel. So in 47, there were a lot of incidents between Arabs and Jews. And Haifa is located where a major refinery that the British built. And that refinery employed both Arabs and Jews. So there was a fight between the two, and people got killed from both sides. Our house was one of the suburbs of Haifa. My father was grocery store in Haifa. He came to the village when he was 11, 12 years old, and he established his future. So he built a house. You know, the tendency among the Arabs that the sign of success is to build some kind of building that you can call it is my house. It happened, the house in that suburb happened on a hill because that part of town had a downtown and then houses along the. So what happened is one of the people who died in that incident in the refinery happened to be from the origin where my father comes from. He knew that people, so he took the body to the village. At that night, the Haganah, which is at the time the Israeli army attacked that town, and they landed in our house on top of the building, and they were shooting. We don't remember. We were 8 people in a small bathroom. We had 2 girls who were 1 year old. And somehow we managed that the girls will not cry because they happened to put on the stairs, and the building is 2 parts, an older part and the newer part. In the newer part, we were located. So went down and they broke the other door and they looked inside, nobody, and they said, okay, nobody. Well, 4 or 5 hours later, dawn came, and therefore now people start coming. My father came to town in the morning, and people were congratulating him for being alive, and he didn't understand what was going on. So he came to the house, and of course, my mother was very, very upset, and they decided this is the time to move. So we moved as a result of that violence because the next day, any house they entered into, they killed everyone. So then we moved to that village. The name of it is Al-Fahim. And at that time, Iraqi army was located in that region, and there was nothing to do because my father lost everything. No money, nothing, absolutely nothing. We left the house as is. We went just for some clothes. Some of our relatives received us, and we lived there for less than a year. And then we moved to Nablus, where Dr. was from, thinking that maybe we can have some business to run. I remember the neighborhood, Dr. was. Nevertheless, we were in desperate situation, no school, and 8 people lived in one room. And these people who owned that house at the time, they had several rooms, and they rented them like we did, with 1 kitchen, 1 bathroom. Now, early in 49, King Abdullah was then the king of Jordan, which is the great grandfather of the current king. He and Golda Meir, who was Prime Minister of Israel at the time, somehow they reached an agreement to give part of Palestine, which was under Jordan, to Israel. Those of you who are familiar with it, it connects Afula with Tel Aviv on land, and therefore east of this land, west of that land, it's all property of people who had to leave it. So Israel took over in 49, and when we heard that, my father said, we might as well just go back to the village, and maybe we will have a chance to go back to Haifa. So the village was given to the Israeli. We had a martial law. Again, no school, no clothing, nothing from 5 p.m. to 5 p.m. That lasted for over a year. Okay. So somehow my father made connection with some people who had business in Haifa, and we managed to migrate back to Haifa. Okay. That's one. The gentleman who spoke, I think he spoke absolutely the truth. Those of us who lived that life remember all of it, and we know all of it. My Arabic teacher in high school, he was a poet, was critical of the occupation. he got deported because he was outspoken person. So many people were expelled as a result of their views. Now, we are just, that is an example of what happened. And there were many such things as those massacre of Deir Yassin and many others as well. When Israel took over that region, they put it under martial law, and therefore nobody's allowed to see anything. I tell my friend now, it's different these days. People have a lot more courage than my generation. If we found the the shell of a bullet, we will not pick it up because you might be questioned where you got it, and they will make story about it, and you'll be in trouble. Now, one of my sisters got married in 1950, and her husband, correct me, 1960, I'm sorry, 1960, and she lived in Nazareth. In those days, in order to go visit her, I had to take a permit. I had to go to the police station, get a permit to Nazareth to visit for a day or two, and they will be checking some people. If I wanted to go to the village, I had to travel for about an hour and a half on a bus and walk from the main road to where the ruler is for about an hour. And then you have to get a permit, why you have to go, how many days, and I used to do that. So situation for the Arabs within Israel was very difficult. I know I finished high school there in 58, 59. I did not have any books. There were absolutely no Arabic books available unless somebody had them from before. We were desperate to read journals or articles or anything, but we were committed to the radio. We didn't have a TV. And everything we listened to, we actually somehow, when I look back at it, I'd say maybe I wasted some time listening to all of that because really none of it was very helpful. But that is really the situation, and I left my home in 1962, the United States, to go to school. So I have a house, I have a family, both in the city as well as in the village. We are in the United States, myself here at Toledo and my sister. I have 3 nephews who live in California, 4 of them, and 2 nephews who live in Columbus area. I would say maybe I was number 2, maybe number 3 of Arabs leaving their home to come to the United States. This was very unusual. But that's what happened.
Thank you, Salah. I think time is up. And I think we need to just educate ourselves more about the so many aspects of the conflict that's going on. And as he said in the lecture, history is very relevant, very important for us to know history. And I was exposed to a new kind of discipline, history, called oral history at Wayne State. I was doing my master's degree. Professor Mace, actually, for those of you who know her, she's a Christian Palestinian, and she actually got her PhD also from Oxford, and she was teaching us oral history. And oral history is based on getting history from the people who lived it and interviewing them and writing down the information and teaching historians or young historians the techniques of how to interview someone who lived during this area. So thank you, Dr. Salah, for this information, very touching. So thank you very much for coming, and time for that. Now,